What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest stars walks onto a late-night talk show expecting a normal conversation, only to be blindsided by a host who seems more interested in tearing him down than welcoming him? In just 39 seconds, a single comment would transform a friendly interview into one of the most explosive moments in talk show history. Stephen Colbert, the man trusted by millions to deliver laughs and entertainment, would reveal a side of himself that shocked the world. And Mark Wahlberg, the guest who came to promote his latest film, would be pushed to his absolute breaking point. Before we dive into what really happened that night, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below with your thoughts on this whole situation. Now, let's get into it. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement. The lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and Mark Wahlberg walked out onto the stage with that signature confident smile. He waved to the crowd, shook Stephen Colbert's hand, and sat down in the guest chair. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed like it was going to be just another fun late-night interview. But from the very first question, something felt off. Stephen leaned back in his chair with this strange smirk on his face. He looked at Mark and said, "So, Mark, you're here to talk about your new movie. But let's be honest. Do you ever wonder if you're just playing the same character over and over again?" The audience laughed nervously. Mark's smile faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly. He chuckled and said, "Well, Stephen, I think every actor brings something different to each role. I take my craft seriously and I try to bring authenticity to every character I play." Stephen wasn't satisfied with that answer. He leaned forward and said, "Authenticity? That's interesting, because I've seen your movies and I've got to say, it feels like you're just being Mark Wahlberg in different costumes." The audience went quiet. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was something else. Mark shifted in his seat and you could see the confusion on his face. He said, "I'm not sure what you're getting at here, Stephen. I've played cops, soldiers, boxers, fathers. These are all different people with different stories." But Stephen kept pushing. He said, "Sure, but they all have that same tough guy energy, that same Boston accent, that same." And he paused here for effect, limited range. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Mark's jaw tightened. He said, "Limited range? Stephen, I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I've worked with some of the greatest directors in the world. I've been nominated for awards. I built a career on hard work and dedication." Stephen laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was condescending. He said, "Oh, come on, Mark. Don't get defensive. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You're a movie star, sure, but are you really an actor? There's a difference, you know." Mark's face was turning red now. He took a deep breath and said, "Okay, Stephen, I came here tonight to talk about my film, to have a good time, and to connect with your audience. I didn't come here to be insulted." The audience was completely silent. People were looking at each other, wondering if this was part of some scripted bit, but it wasn't. This was real tension. Stephen, instead of backing down, doubled down. He said, "Insulted? I'm just being honest. Isn't that what we do here? We have honest conversations. Or would you prefer I just lob you softball questions and pretend everything you do is brilliant?" Mark leaned forward in his chair. His voice was calm but firm. He said, "There's a difference between having an honest conversation and being disrespectful. You invited me here as your guest. I showed up. I'm being professional, but you're sitting here trying to tear me down in front of millions of people. What's the point of that? What are you trying to prove?" Stephen shrugged. He actually shrugged. He said, "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just doing my job. And my job is to ask tough questions, not to kiss up to every celebrity who walks through that door." Mark nodded slowly. He said, "Tough questions are fine. I've done hundreds of interviews. I've been asked tough questions before, but there's a way to do it with respect. And right now, you're not showing me any respect at all." The host leaned back again, that smirk still on his face. He said, "Respect? You want me to respect you? Tell me, Mark, what have you done lately that deserves my respect? You make action movies for teenage boys. You sell protein powders on Instagram. You're basically a brand at this point, not an artist." This was the moment everything changed. Mark stood up from his chair. The audience gasped. He looked directly at Stephen and said, "You know what? I don't need this. I came here as a guest. I came here with respect for you and your show, but clearly, you don't have any respect for me." Stephen looked surprised. Maybe he thought Mark would just take it. Maybe he thought they could keep going back and forth. But Mark wasn't playing that game anymore. He said, "I've spent my entire life working hard. I came from nothing. I built everything I have through dedication and sweat, and I don't need to sit here and listen to someone who sits behind a desk every night mock me and my career. Steven tried to interrupt, but Mark wasn't finished. He said, "You want to talk about being an artist? You read jokes off a teleprompter. You interview people for 15 minutes and then send them on their way. Don't act like you're some kind of creative genius." The audience didn't know how to react. Some people were silent. Others were starting to murmur. Steven's face had changed now. The smirk was gone. He said, "Mark, come on, sit down. We're just having a conversation." But Mark shook his head. He said, "No, this isn't a conversation. A conversation requires two people who respect each other. You don't respect me. You've made that very clear. So I'm done here." Steven stood up too. He said, "You're seriously going to walk off my show because I asked you a few tough questions? That's pretty thin skin, don't you think?" Mark turned to face him directly. He said, "This has nothing to do with tough questions. This has everything to do with how you're treating me. You're being condescending. You're being rude. And frankly, you're being unprofessional. I don't care how big your show is or how many viewers you have. I'm not going to sit here and be disrespected." Steven's voice got louder. He said, "Disrespected? Are you kidding me right now? I'm giving you a platform. I'm giving you airtime. Millions of people are watching this interview. You should be grateful." And that was it. Those words, "you should be grateful," were the final straw. Mark's eyes widened. He said, "Grateful? You think I should be grateful for this? For you attacking my career, questioning my talent, and treating me like I'm beneath you? Steven, let me tell you something. I don't need your show. I don't need your platform. I was doing just fine before I walked in here, and I'll be doing just fine after I leave." The host's face was getting red now too. He said, "Fine, then leave. Walk off the set. Show everyone what kind of person you really are. Show them that you can't handle a little criticism." Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. He said, "Criticism? You call this criticism? This is you trying to make yourself feel important by tearing someone else down. That's not criticism. That's just being mean, and I don't have time for it." Steven pointed at him and said, "You know what your problem is, Mark? You're so used to everyone telling you how great you are that you can't handle it when someone tells you the truth. You're not as talented as you think you are. You're not as important as you think you are. And right now, you're proving that you're not as tough as you pretend to be in your movies." The audience was in complete shock. This had gone way beyond awkward. This was a full-blown fight happening on live television. Mark took a step closer to the desk. His voice was steady but intense. He said, "You want to talk about truth? Here's the truth. You're sitting in that chair because someone gave you a show. You think that makes you better than other people. You think that gives you the right to belittle your guests. But all it really shows is that you're insecure. You're threatened by people who have actually built something real. So you try to tear them down to make yourself feel bigger." Steven slammed his hand on the desk. He said, "I'm not threatened by you. Why would I be threatened by you? I have nothing to be threatened by." Mark shook his head. He said, "If you weren't threatened, you wouldn't be acting like this. You'd be having a normal conversation. But instead, you're attacking me from the moment I sat down. That's not confidence, Steven. That's insecurity. And the audience can see it. Everyone watching at home can see it." The host was clearly flustered now. He said, "Okay, you know what? If you're going to walk off, then walk off. I don't need you here. I have plenty of other guests who would love to be in that chair." Mark nodded. He said, "Then go get them, because I'm done." He started to walk toward the exit, but Steven kept talking. He said, "This is unbelievable. You come on my show, you get asked a few questions you don't like, and you throw a tantrum like a child." Mark stopped and turned around one more time. He said, "A tantrum? I'm standing up for myself. There's a difference. You want to sit there and act like you're some kind of victim, but you're the one who started this. You're the one who decided to attack me instead of having a respectful interview. So don't play innocent now." The two men stared at each other across the studio. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Finally, Mark said, "Good luck with the rest of your show, Steven. I hope your next guest has thicker skin than I do." And with that, he walked off the stage. The audience sat in stunned silence. Steven stood behind his desk, looking like he didn't know what to do next. His producers were probably screaming in his ear through his earpiece. The cameras were still rolling. This was live television, and it had just gone completely off the rails. Steven tried to compose himself. He looked at the camera and said, "Well, folks, I guess Mark Wahlberg has left the building. We'll be right back after this commercial break." But you could see it in his face. He knew this was bad. He knew this wasn't going to look good. The problem was, it was too late to take any of it back. The damage was done. What had started as a regular late-night interview had turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history. And it was all because Stephen Colbert had decided to attack his guest instead of welcoming him. Mark had every right to walk off that stage. He had every right to defend himself. Behind the scenes, chaos was unfolding. Mark walked through the backstage area with his team following close behind. One of the producers tried to stop him, saying, "Please, Mark, just give us a minute. We can fix this. Let's get you back out there." But Mark wasn't having it. He looked at the producer and said, "Fix what exactly? Your host just spent the last 10 minutes insulting me on live television. There's nothing to fix here. I'm leaving." His manager pulled him aside and whispered, "Mark, think about this. If you leave now, this is going to be everywhere tomorrow. Every news outlet, every social media platform. Are you sure you want to do this?" Mark looked his manager dead in the eye and said, "I'm absolutely sure. What I'm not going to do is sit there and let someone disrespect me just because they have a TV show. I don't care what the headlines say. I know what happened out there." Meanwhile, back on stage, Stephen was trying to regain control of the situation. The commercial break had given him a minute to think, but when they came back on air, he looked rattled. He said, "Welcome back, everyone. As you saw before the break, Mark Wahlberg decided to leave our show tonight. I want to address what just happened because I'm sure many of you are wondering what that was all about." He paused and took a sip of water. You could tell he was choosing his words carefully now. He said, "Look, I ask tough questions. That's what I do. That's what this show is about. We don't just sit here and promote movies and pretend everything is perfect. We have real conversations. And sometimes those conversations get uncomfortable. But here's the thing. The audience at home wasn't buying it. Social media was already exploding. People were posting clips of the interview. They were analyzing every word, every facial expression. And the overwhelming response was that Stephen had crossed a line. People were saying he was rude, he was unprofessional, he was acting like a bully. One person tweeted, "I've watched Stephen for years and I've never seen him treat a guest like that. What was he thinking?" Another person wrote, "Mark Wahlberg showed incredible restraint. I would have walked off even sooner." Back at the studio, Stephen continued his monologue. He said, "I respect Mark Wahlberg. I think he's talented. I think he's worked hard to get where he is. But I also think it's important to have honest discussions about celebrity culture and the work that gets put out into the world. If we can't have those discussions, then what's the point?" But the problem was, it hadn't been an honest discussion. It had been an attack. From the very beginning, Stephen had come at Mark with an agenda. He hadn't asked genuine questions. He had made accusations disguised as questions. Stephen kept talking. He said, "I've had thousands of guests on this show. We've had disagreements before. We've had debates, but we've always been able to work through them like adults. So I'm disappointed that tonight ended the way it did. I'm disappointed that Mark felt the need to walk off rather than continue our conversation." And there it was again, that phrase. He was disappointed in Mark. He was making it sound like Mark was the problem, like Mark was the one who had behaved badly. The audience in the studio shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One person in the front row actually shook their head. You could see it on camera. Stephen noticed it too. He cleared his throat and said, "Anyway, we have a great show lined up for you tonight. Our next guest is a comedian who has a new special coming out on streaming. Please welcome to the stage." But nobody was paying attention to the next guest anymore. The damage had been done. The interview with Mark Wahlberg was all anyone wanted to talk about. By the time the show ended, the clip had millions of views online. News outlets were picking it up. Entertainment websites were writing articles with headlines like "Mark Wahlberg walks off Colbert after heated exchange" and "Stephen Colbert crosses the line with Mark Wahlberg." Television critics were weighing in. One critic wrote, "Stephen Colbert forgot the first rule of being a talk show host tonight. You're supposed to make your guests feel welcome, not attack them. The host is supposed to facilitate conversation, not dominate it with their own agenda." What we saw tonight was a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview. Another critic said, "Mark Wahlberg handled that situation with grace and dignity. He stood up for himself without losing his temper. He made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate disrespect, and then he left. That's not thin-skinned. That's having boundaries. We need more people in Hollywood willing to set boundaries like that." But Stephen's supporters were trying to defend him. They were saying things like he was just doing his job, or celebrities need to be able to handle criticism, or Mark overreacted. But those arguments weren't landing because people had watched the interview with their own eyes. They had seen Stephen smirk. They had heard his condescending tone. They had watched him dismiss Mark's career and mock his work. This wasn't a journalist asking tough questions. This was a host trying to humiliate his guest. There's a difference, and people could see it. Let's go back to what was actually said during those final moments before Mark left, because this is where things got really intense. When Mark said he was done and started to walk away, Steven made one more comment that pushed things over the edge. He said, "You know, Mark, maybe this is why you stick to action movies. You can't handle conflict in real life." Mark stopped in his tracks. He turned around slowly, and you could see the fire in his eyes. He said, "What did you just say?" Steven, clearly realizing he had gone too far but unable to back down now, repeated himself. He said, "I said maybe this is why you do action movies. Because in real life, when someone challenges you, you run away." The audience gasped. Some people actually stood up, like they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Mark walked back toward the desk. He wasn't threatening, he wasn't aggressive, but he was clearly done playing nice. He said, "I'm gonna say this one more time so you understand. I didn't come here to be challenged. I came here as a guest. There's a difference between a challenge and an attack. What you're doing is attacking me, and I'm not running away. I'm choosing not to participate in whatever game you're playing." Steven leaned forward and said, "It's not a game, Mark. It's a conversation. And if you can't handle an honest conversation, then maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews at all." Mark's voice was calm but firm. He said, "I've done thousands of interviews, Steven. I've sat down with journalists who have asked me hard questions about my past, about my choices, about my career. I've answered all of them honestly. But those journalists treated me with respect. They didn't sit there and mock me. They didn't try to make me look small to make themselves look big." Steven stood up from behind his desk now. He said, "I'm not trying to make you look small. I'm trying to have a real conversation, but you're too sensitive to handle it." And there was that word again, sensitive. It was like Steven had a script in his head and he was sticking to it no matter what. He was determined to paint Mark as the bad guy, as the one who couldn't take criticism, as the one who was overreacting. But it wasn't working. The audience could see what was really happening. Mark took a deep breath. He said, "You keep using that word, sensitive, like it's a bad thing to have boundaries, like it's weak to stand up for yourself. But I'm not being sensitive, Steven. I'm being smart. I'm smart enough to know when someone is treating me poorly, and I'm smart enough to walk away from it." Steven threw his hands up in the air. He said, "Fine, walk away. That's what you're good at, apparently, walking away when things get tough." Mark shook his head. He said, "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about things getting tough. I can handle tough. I've handled tough my entire life. This is about you being disrespectful. And I don't have to stand here and take that from anyone. Not from you, not from anyone." With that, he turned and walked off the stage for the second time. But this time, Steven didn't try to stop him. He just stood there, watching Mark leave. The cameras captured everything. They captured the look on Steven's face, which was a mixture of shock and anger. They captured the audience's stunned silence. They captured one of the producers rushing onto the stage to talk to Steven. And they captured the exact moment when Steven realized that he had made a huge mistake. You could see it in his eyes. The realization that this wasn't going to blow over. This wasn't going to be forgotten by tomorrow. This was going to be a defining moment of his career, and not in a good way. Steven sat back down at his desk. He looked at the camera and said, "Well, I guess that's all the time we have with Mark Wahlberg tonight. Let's take another break." The show cut to commercial, but behind the scenes, things were falling apart. The producers were in full panic mode. They knew they had a public relations disaster on their hands. They knew that by morning, every talk show and news program would be discussing what happened. And they knew that Steven was going to take the brunt of the criticism. One of the executive producers came up to Steven during the commercial break. She said, "What were you thinking? Why did you keep pushing him like that?" Steven, still defensive, said, "I was doing my job. I was asking real questions." The producer shook her head. She said, "No, Steven, you weren't. You were attacking him. There's a difference. We've had tough interviews before, but this was different. This was personal. And now we're going to have to deal with the fallout." Steven looked frustrated. He said, "So what do you want me to do? Go back out there and apologize?" The producer thought for a moment and said, "Honestly, yes, that's exactly what you should do." But Steven refused. He said, "I'm not apologizing for doing my job. If Mark can't handle a tough interview, that's on him, not on me." The producer walked away, shaking her head. She knew there was no getting through to him right now. His pride was getting in the way of his judgment, and that pride was about to cost him dearly. When the show came back from commercial, Steven tried to move on like nothing had happened. He introduced his next guest with forced enthusiasm. He told a few jokes that fell flat. The energy in the studio was completely off. Even the band seemed subdued. The audience, which had been excited at the beginning of the show, now seemed uncomfortable and awkward. They clapped when they were supposed to, but there was no real enthusiasm behind it. Everyone was still thinking about what had just happened with Mark. The rest of the show limped along until it finally ended. Steven gave his closing remarks, thanked the audience, and the camera stopped rolling. As soon as they were off air, Steven walked off the set without talking to anyone. He went straight to his dressing room and closed the door. Meanwhile, Mark Wahlberg had already left the building. He was in his car, heading back to his hotel. His phone was blowing up with calls and texts from friends, family, and colleagues. Everyone wanted to know what happened. Everyone wanted to know if he was okay. His publicist called and said, "Mark, we need to talk about how we're going to handle this. The story is everywhere already." Mark sighed. He said, "I don't want to make a big statement. I don't want to add fuel to the fire. What happened tonight speaks for itself. People can watch the interview and make their own judgments." His publicist said, "But don't you want to defend yourself? Don't you want to tell your side of the story?" Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My side of the story is what everyone saw on camera. I was respectful until I wasn't being respected. I tried to have a normal conversation until it became clear that wasn't possible. And then I left. That's it. That's the whole story," his publicist said. "But don't you want to defend yourself? Don't you want to tell your side of the story?" Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My side of the story is what everyone saw on camera. I was respectful until I wasn't being respected. I tried to have a normal conversation until it became clear that wasn't possible. And then I left. That's it. That's the whole story. I don't need to say anything else." And he was right. The video spoke for itself. Within hours, media analysts were breaking down every exchange, every facial expression, every word that was said. They were creating timelines of the interview, showing exactly when things turned from uncomfortable to hostile. One analyst said, "If you watch carefully, you can see Mark trying to defuse the situation multiple times. He laughs off the first insult. He tries to redirect the conversation. He stays professional even when Steven clearly isn't. It's only after repeated attacks that he finally decides to leave." Another analyst pointed out something important. She said, "Notice how Steven kept trying to frame this as Mark being unable to handle criticism. But that's not what this was about. Mark has been in the public eye for decades. He's been criticized by professional film critics, by journalists, by audiences. He's handled all of that just fine. What he couldn't handle and shouldn't have to handle is being disrespected by someone who invited him onto their show." Back in his dressing room, Steven was finally starting to realize the magnitude of what had happened. His phone was ringing nonstop. His agent was calling. The network executives were calling. His own family members were calling. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. "What were you thinking?" His wife called and said, "Steven, I just watched what happened. Why did you treat him like that? That wasn't like you." Steven tried to explain. He said, "I was just trying to have an honest conversation. I was trying to push back against the celebrity worship culture. I was trying to do something different." His wife was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, there's a difference between honest and cruel. What you did tonight was cruel." Those words hit Steven hard. Cruel. That wasn't how he saw himself. He saw himself as a truth teller, as someone who wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions. But maybe, just maybe, he had crossed a line. Maybe he had let his own ego get in the way of basic decency. The next morning, the story was everywhere. It was the top trending topic on every social media platform. News channels were discussing it, radio shows were taking calls about it, everyone had an opinion, and the vast majority of those opinions were critical of Steven. One morning show host said, "I've been watching Stephen Colbert for years, and I've always respected his work. But what I saw last night was disappointing. He forgot that his guests are human beings, not punching bags for his jokes." Another host said, "Mark Wahlberg showed us something important last night. He showed us that it's okay to walk away from situations where you're not being treated with respect. That's not weakness, that's strength." Even some of Steven's fellow late-night hosts were weighing in, though they were trying to be diplomatic about it. One of them said, "Look, we all have bad nights. We all make mistakes. But I think what happened last night is a reminder that we have to remember why people come on our shows. They're there to promote their work, to connect with audiences, to have fun. They're not there to be torn down." Steven's team scheduled an emergency meeting. They needed to figure out how to handle this. The head of the network was there. The show's producers were there. Steven's publicist was there. Everyone looked stressed. The network executive spoke first. He said, "Steven, we need to talk about what happened last night. This is getting out of control. The backlash is intense and it's not dying down. We need to figure out a strategy." Steven, still defensive, said, "I don't think I did anything wrong. I asked tough questions. If people can't handle that, then that's their problem." The room went silent. Finally, one of the producers spoke up. She said, "Steven, with all due respect, you need to watch the tape again, because what you think happened and what actually happened are two different things." She pulled up the video on her laptop and played it for everyone in the room. As they watched, you could see Steven's expression changing. He was seeing it now from the outside, seeing it the way millions of viewers had seen it. And for the first time, he was understanding how bad it looked. When the video ended, the producer said, "Do you see it now? Do you see how you came across?" Steven nodded slowly. He said, I was pretty harsh, wasn't I?" The producer said, "Harsh is an understatement. You were hostile. You attacked him from the beginning, and you never let up." The network executive leaned forward. He said, "Here's the situation. We're getting calls from other celebrities saying they don't want to come on the show anymore. They're worried about being treated the same way Mark was treated. We're getting pressure from advertisers who are concerned about being associated with what happened. And we're getting thousands of complaints from viewers. This isn't just going to blow over." Steven ran his hands through his hair. He looked exhausted. He said, "So what do you want me to do?" The executive said, "You need to apologize, publicly, and you need to mean it." Steven bristled at that. He said, "Apologize? For doing my job?" The publicist jumped in. She said, "Steven, this isn't about your job. This is about how you treated another human being. You can ask tough questions without being cruel. You can challenge someone without insulting them. What you did last night went way beyond professional boundaries." One of the producers added, "Think about it this way. If someone treated you the way you treated Mark, how would you feel? Would you just sit there and take it? Or would you stand up for yourself?" Steven was quiet. He knew they were right. He had spent the whole night and morning trying to justify his behavior, trying to convince himself that he had done nothing wrong. But deep down, he knew he had messed up. He had let his ego take over. He had treated a guest poorly, and now he was facing the consequences. The meeting continued for another hour. They discussed different ways Steven could address the situation. They talked about doing a formal apology on the show. They talked about reaching out to Mark privately. They talked about making a statement through social media. Finally, Steven said, "I'll apologize on tonight's show. I'll be honest about what happened, and I'll take responsibility." But even as he said those words, you could tell part of him still didn't want to do it. Part of him still thought he was right. That night, when Steven's show started, the audience was different. Usually, his crowds were enthusiastic and supportive, but tonight, there was tension in the air. People were curious about what he was going to say. They were waiting to see if he would really apologize, or if he would try to justify his actions. Steven came out on stage, and instead of his usual energetic entrance, he walked slowly. He sat down at his desk and looked directly at the camera. He said, "Good evening, everyone. Before we get to tonight's show, I need to address what happened last night with Mark Wahlberg." He paused and took a breath. He said, "I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about that interview and reading what people have been saying. And I want to be clear about something. I was wrong." The audience was silent, waiting to hear more. Steven continued. He said, "I invited Mark onto this show as a guest. He came here in good faith, ready to talk about his work and have a conversation. And instead of treating him with the respect he deserved, I attacked him. I was condescending, I was rude, and I was out of line." He looked down at his desk for a moment, then back up at the camera. He said, "I want to apologize to Mark. You didn't deserve to be treated that way. You handled the situation with far more grace than I did. You stood up for yourself when you should have never had to in the first place. I'm sorry." Some people in the audience started to clap, but Steven held up his hand. He said, "I also want to apologize to all of you watching at home and here in the studio. You tune into this show because you want to be entertained. You want to laugh. You want to hear interesting conversations. What you saw last night wasn't entertainment. It was uncomfortable, and it was wrong. And I take full responsibility for that." He shifted in his seat. He said, "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've interviewed hundreds of people, and I've always tried to ask meaningful questions and have real conversations. But last night, I crossed a line. I let my own agenda get in the way of basic human decency. And that's on me. Nobody else. Just me." The apology was sincere. You could hear it in his voice. But the question remained whether it was enough, whether Mark would accept it, whether the public would forgive him, whether this moment would define his career going forward. Social media's reaction to the apology was mixed. Some people said, "Good for him for owning up to it. That takes courage." Others said, "He only apologized because he got caught. He only apologized because of the backlash." One person tweeted, A real apology would have happened privately, directly to Mark, before any public statement. This feels like damage control, not genuine remorse. Another person wrote, I appreciate that he apologized, but it doesn't change what happened. You can't unring that bell. Mark saw the apology. His publicist sent him the clip. He watched it alone in his hotel room. When it was over, he sat there thinking. His phone rang. It was a friend calling to ask what he thought about Steven's apology. Mark said, I don't know. I mean, it's good that he apologized, but it doesn't change how I felt sitting in that chair last night. His friend said, Are you going to respond? Are you going to say anything publicly? Mark thought about it. He said, I don't think so. I said what I needed to say when I walked off that stage. The apology is between him and his conscience. I'm moving on. And that was Mark's strength through all of this. He didn't try to make it into a bigger thing than it was. He didn't go on other shows to talk about it. He didn't write long posts on social media. He simply stood up for himself in the moment and then moved forward with his life. A few days later, a reporter caught up with Mark at a movie premiere. They asked him about the incident. Mark smiled and said, Look, we all have bad days. Steven apologized and I accept that. I'm not going to hold a grudge. Life's too short for that. The reporter pressed further. They said, But do you think he meant it? Do you think he really understands what he did wrong? Mark paused. He said, I think he's starting to understand, and that's all I can ask for. Whether he fully gets it or not, that's his journey to take. I've moved on. That response showed the world something important about Mark. He wasn't vindictive. He wasn't trying to destroy Steven's career. He wasn't milking the situation for attention. He had set a boundary, he had stood up for himself, and then he let it go. That's maturity. That's class. Back at the show, Steven was trying to rebuild trust. He was being more careful with his guests. He was listening more and attacking less. He was remembering why people invited guests onto talk shows in the first place, to celebrate their work, to learn their stories, to create connections. But the incident with Mark had left a mark on him, pun intended. He was more cautious now, more aware of how his words could impact people. Some viewers said the show had lost its edge. Others said it had finally found its heart. The truth was probably somewhere in between. One of Steven's longtime viewers wrote to the show. The letter said, I've been watching you since your first episode. I've laughed at your jokes. I've appreciated your political commentary. I've respected your intelligence. But what happened with Mark Wahlberg made me see something I hadn't seen before. It made me realize that being smart doesn't give you the right to be cruel. The letter continued, I'm glad you apologized. But more than that, I hope you learned something. I hope you learn that the people who come on your show are not characters or punching bags. They're real people with feelings, with families, with careers they've worked hard to build, and they deserve to be treated with respect. Period. That letter was read by one of the producers and shared with Steven. He read it several times. It resonated with him because it was exactly right. He had treated Mark like a character, like someone who existed only for his entertainment and his audience's entertainment. He had forgotten that Mark was a real person who had feelings and boundaries and dignity. The incident became a teaching moment, not just for Steven, but for the entire industry. Other talk show hosts started having conversations about how they treated their guests. Producers started implementing new guidelines about respect and professionalism. The whole culture started to shift, even if just a little bit. One late-night host said in an interview, What happened with Mark and Steven was a wake-up call for all of us. We have a responsibility to the people who come on our shows. We have power in these situations, and we need to use that power responsibly. Months went by. The story gradually faded from the headlines. People moved on to other controversies, other scandals, other moments of drama. But for those who were there, for those who watched it happen live, the memory remained. It remained as a reminder that respect is not optional. It remained as proof that standing up for yourself is never the wrong choice. It remained as evidence that sometimes walking away is the strongest thing you can do. Mark continued making movies. He continued building his businesses. He continued living his life with integrity and purpose. And every now and then, when someone would bring up the incident in an interview, he would smile and say, "That was a moment that taught me something important. It taught me that my boundaries matter. It taught me that I don't have to accept disrespect from anyone, no matter how big their platform is. And it taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is goodbye." Steven continued hosting his show. He continued making people laugh, but he carried the lesson with him. Every time a new guest walked out onto a stage, he remembered Mark. He remembered what happened when ego overtook empathy. Years later, a journalism student asked Steven about the biggest mistake he had made in his career. Steven didn't hesitate. He said, There was a night when I had Mark Wahlberg on the show, and I treated him poorly. I was rude, I was condescending, and I deserved it when he walked off my stage. That moment taught me more about being a good interviewer than any success I've ever had. It taught me that my job is to bring out the best in people, not to tear them down. The student asked, "Did you ever talk to Mark again after that night?" Stephen shook his head. He said, "No, we never spoke again. I apologized publicly, but we never had a private conversation about it." And you know what? I think that's okay. I think some apologies don't require a response. I think sometimes the best thing you can do is learn from your mistakes and do better going forward. And that's what I've tried to do. The incident between Mark Wahlberg and Stephen Colbert became more than just a viral moment. It became a cultural touchstone. It became a reference point for discussions about respect, boundaries, and power dynamics in media. It showed that celebrities are not just products to be consumed. They are people who deserve dignity. It showed that hosts are not just entertainers. They are gatekeepers who have responsibility. And it showed that audiences are not just passive viewers. They are active participants who can hold people accountable. So what's the lesson here? What's the takeaway from this whole situation? It's simple, really. Treat people with respect. Whether you're a talk show host or a guest, whether you're famous or unknown, whether you have power or you don't, respect is non-negotiable. It's the foundation of every good interaction, every meaningful conversation, every healthy relationship. Mark Wahlberg understood that. He knew his worth. He knew his boundaries. And when those boundaries were crossed, he didn't hesitate to enforce them. That's not being difficult. That's not being sensitive. That's being a person who values themselves enough to demand respect. Stephen Colbert learned that lesson the hard way. He learned that talent and intelligence and success don't give you the right to treat people poorly. He learned that every guest who walks onto your stage is a human being first and a celebrity second. And he learned that sometimes the most important interviews are the ones that go wrong because they teach you what really matters. The audience learned something too. They learned to pay attention not just to what is said, but to how it's said. They learned to recognize the difference between tough questions and personal attacks. They learned that it's okay to call out bad behavior even when it comes from someone you like or respect. So if you take anything away from this moment in television history, let it be this: stand up for yourself. Know your worth. Don't let anyone make you feel small. And if someone crosses your boundaries, you have every right to walk away, just like Mark did that night. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think about everything that went down. I'll see you in the next one.